In 1932, as dole queues lengthened across America, 13 million were out of work. Nearly a third of the people relied on handouts from private charities. There was no welfare state to help them. It was the time of the Great Depression. Evictions became a common sight as people could no longer afford to keep up their payments for their furniture and their homes. The Republican president, Herbert Hoover, really believed in self-help, not government help. He thought a welfare state encouraged idleness. His efforts to halt unemployment had been too little and too late. Now the very poor had to live in shanty towns, which they bitterly called Hoovervilles. In a newspaper interview at the time, Hoover told a reporter, "Nobody is actually starving." The mood in town and country was one of hopelessness and despair. It seemed that things would never get better.
There were some commentators by 1932 who believed that they were watching the end of an historical era in which laissez-faire free market capitalism was absolutely imploding and proving its historical bankruptcy.
The evidence of decline was everywhere. 13 million Americans were out of work, millions living beyond the point of despair. Soup kitchens and squatter camps reflected the new reality. These were the worst of times. After 4 years in power, the Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover was a beaten man. He insisted that the Wall Street crash of October 1929 was a result of economic forces beyond his or anyone else's control. Not so, argued the supremely self-confident and charismatic governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, at the age of 50, was seeking the Democratic nomination for president.
This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
In essence, Roosevelt ascended to the presidency when he accepted that nomination. In the 1932 election, he had one overwhelming advantage. He wasn't the incumbent. Roosevelt won nearly 60% of the popular vote. He accepted the affirmation of the nation from his home in Hyde Park along New York's Hudson River. Under threatening skies and a cold northerly wind, FDR appeared supremely confident. His words reaffirmed his abiding faith in America and his determination to carry the nation back to prosperity.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
Roosevelt made it clear that he was demanding broad executive authority to reverse the ravages wrought by economic stagnation.
Roosevelt is saying to the country, you have a leader now, and you have a leader who is not afraid of exercising power. I'm willing to exercise power as though the Great Depression were a war, as though we were being invaded by a foreign foe, and I'm going to be your commander-in-chief in this war against the Depression.
The first day of his term, he was faced with the imminent collapse of the nation's banking system.
Since the Wall Street crash, over 5,000 banks had closed down. People withdrew their money from the banks and kept it at home. There was no confidence in the system. To stop the panic, Roosevelt closed all the banks for 4 days. In the famous first 100 days, he persuaded Congress to pass 15 new laws to fight the emergency. Now something was happening, and confidence began to return.
Roosevelt said literally to these different groups, I'm going to lock you in a room and you're not to come out till you get a solution to this. Now, that's something that presidents had never done before. This was an insistent leadership for which there is really no parallel in the past.
The presidential coercion produced an agreement. After just a single day's debate, and without waiting for a printed copy to become available, Roosevelt pushed through Congress a sweeping banking reform bill. 8 days after the inauguration, President Roosevelt went before the country to reassure the people that their savings were secure.
I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
The reaction to the legislation went far beyond relief that savings were secure. Most Americans had long since exhausted those anyway. What FDR did in those first days was prove that action was possible, that the inertia could be broken.
The White House received in the week following that address some 400,000 unsolicited letters. The Roosevelt White House had to hire, I believe it was some 70-some-odd people to handle this stream of mail. The Hoover White House had employed exactly one person to handle that kind of unsolicited mail to the president.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country's behind you, thrilled with hope and patriotism.
But the country was not entirely behind the populist president. Large parts of the corporate elite despised what Roosevelt's New Deal stood for.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
A congressional committee ultimately found evidence of a plot to overthrow Roosevelt. According to Butler, the conspiracy included representatives of some of America's top corporations, including J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Goodyear Tire.
The first 100 days marked the most prodigious legislative session in the nation's history, a yardstick against which every succeeding president would be judged, a tidal wave of New Deal initiatives to preserve the Union. As Eleanor later pointed out, FDR knew it wouldn't last.
He felt that a great deal had to be done in those days, because he knew quite well that there would come a period when Congress would not be as amenable, when people would not be as amenable. This was an opportunity which must not be missed.
Through programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, Roosevelt hired unemployed youth from America's inner cities to work in the countryside. Passed through Congress on March 31st, participation in the Corps paid $1 a day. Run by the Army, the CCC was attacked from the left for being too militaristic, but by June had enrolled 250,000 young men. Along the way, Roosevelt turned the federal government into the nation's largest employer.
I hope that all over the country they're in as fine condition as the camps that I've seen today. I wish that I could take a couple of months off from the White House and come down here and live with them, because I know I'd get full of health the way they have.
Then, on June 16th, 1933, the centerpiece of the New Deal, the National Industrial Recovery Act, became law after passing the Senate 58-24. It was a compendium of initiatives that would impose unprecedented federal controls on American business.
The underlying philosophy of the NRA was that we'd have a planned economy and that the inefficiencies of the old capitalistic system would be done away with, that they were luxuries that simply could not be afforded with 13 million or more unemployed, with factories running at 15 or 20% of capacity. And the question was, how did you match up America's industrial capacity with the needs of its own society and of the international markets?
That was done by introducing a total of 541 industrial codes to impose wage and price controls. Antitrust laws were scrapped to reduce cost-cutting competition that was driving manufacturers into bankruptcy. To protect a worker's rights, a minimum wage of $12 for a 40-hour week was established, along with the right of labor to bargain collectively. When the NRA passed, 250,000 people marched down Fifth Avenue in New York. It was intended to show popular support for a program designed to tame the unruly cycles of American capitalism by encouraging business and government to work together.
As a boy of 10, I was taken to that parade on Fifth Avenue, and I can still see these groups marching by as though they were medieval guilds, garment workers and other kinds of workers coming along. People went to the newly opened Radio City Music Hall. They went through to the movie. They came out of it 3 hours later. The parade was still going by. It was going by after midnight, and everywhere, even on the panties of chorus girls, were the blue eagles that were the symbols of the NRA.
FDR also orchestrated an extraordinary publicity campaign to rally the nation behind the Blue Eagle.
Things are getting better every day.
Well, Abe, it looks as though we can stop worrying about our country. President Roosevelt has it headed right again.
All it needed was a plan of action and a man with the courage to put it through.
But Roosevelt's critics insisted he had gone too far, that the NRA would destroy, not rescue, the free market economy. They tried to label him a progressive liberal, but at least for the time being, the epithets didn't stick.
A few timid people who fear progress will try to give you new and strange names for what we are doing. Sometimes they will call it fascism, and sometimes communism, and sometimes regimentation, and sometimes socialism. But in so doing, they are trying to make very complex and theoretical something that is really very simple and very practical.
The thing that was so exciting in that first year of Roosevelt's administration was the large number of creative, imaginative people that were brought into the city.
The most influential group was from Columbia University that had been assembled during the 1932 campaign. Known as the Brains Trust, they laid out the initial blueprint for the administrative assault on the Depression. Their role diminished after the election, to be replaced not by the cabinet, but rather by a small cadre of advisors working directly for Roosevelt in the myriad of agencies that sprang out of the New Deal.
During that first 100 days, all the new agencies that Roosevelt created, all the new programs, all the new policies, these were by and large not being administered or run by the traditional cabinet-level departments.
But there were individual cabinet members who did make a significant contribution. Men like Henry Morgenthau at Treasury, Harold Ickes at Interior, and Henry Wallace at Agriculture. But the star became the Labor Secretary, Frances Perkins, the first woman ever selected to serve in the cabinet.
The best part of that early New Deal was the innovative aspects. Let's get after the problem. Let's try. Let's experiment. Even though we haven't had the experience, we aren't sure things will work. And out of that came, of course, tremendously dramatic things.
FDR further expanded his control over the political agenda with sweeping gains in the 1934 midterm election. The Democrats emerged with a record 69 seats in the Senate. The Republicans in the House dropped to just 103 seats, the smallest percentage in their history. But to ensure continued cooperation from the Congress, Roosevelt traveled to Atlanta, Georgia in 1935 to preserve his support among Southern Democrats. It was a presidential charm offensive that would carry a heavy price. Often during his presidency, FDR would retreat to Warm Springs, Georgia, deep in the heart of the old Confederacy. This was a region that fiercely protected its way of life, and that included segregation. For a Northern aristocrat like Roosevelt, it was a time to forge a link with a core constituency within his own Democratic Party.
His long years in Warm Springs gave Southern congressmen who controlled many of the key chairmanships in both houses of Congress a feeling that Roosevelt was at least an adopted Southerner, and this was somebody that they could trust, and he knew how to sweet-talk them.
FDR had clear and tangible achievements to confound his critics. Programs that in 1935 culminated in passage of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA.
It was the largest single appropriation in peacetime in the history of any country in the history of the world. And it succeeded, along with other public works programs, in changing the face of America.
Under the Works Progress Administration, men and women hired by the government were building more than 5,000 schools, 2,500 hospitals, 1,000 airstrips, and 13,000 playgrounds. The greatest political miscalculation of FDR's career grew out of a day 2 years before that New Dealers would remember as Black Monday. That was May 27, 1935, when the Supreme Court struck down the very heart of Roosevelt's New Deal by nullifying the National Recovery Act, insisting that the federal government had exceeded its constitutional authority.
A showdown with the court was inevitable. At no time in our history, before or since, has the court struck down so many pieces of vital legislation. The keystones to FDR's program in the first New Deal were the NRA and the Farm Program, the AAA. The Supreme Court destroyed both.
As the 1936 election approached, he launched an even more ambitious second New Deal with the ferocity usually seen on the field of battle.
Here in America, we are waging a great and successful war. It is not alone a war against want and destitution and economic demoralization. It is more than that. It is a war for the survival of democracy. And so I accept the commission you have tendered me. I join with you. I am enlisted for the duration of the war.
He undertook a massive building program to strengthen the country's infrastructure. He promised power for rural America, where 9 out of every 10 families still lived without electricity. He pushed the Social Security Act through Congress, insisting that all Americans deserved a safety net and that seniors had the right to avoid destitution in their final years. All programs designed, he said, to ensure the survival of American capitalism.
In private, he said more than once to more than one of his associates, he said, if the capitalist class in this country only understood what I'm up to here, they would understand that I am the best friend they've ever had, because I'm reforming this system, the free enterprise system, in ways that will preserve its viability for generations to come. And if it weren't for me, there's a possibility that the forces of truly radical revolution would gather energy and overturn this system altogether. And it's only by reform that the system will survive.
In the 1936 presidential elections, Alfred Landon, Roosevelt's Republican opponent, attacked the New Deal as impractical and extravagant.
After 3 years, it must be obvious to everyone that waste and extravagance do not make jobs.
It is a pitiful spectacle to see Republican leaders call this great program waste and extravagance. Of course we spent money. It went to put needy men and women without jobs to work.
Roosevelt 1280, Landon 664.
As the election results came in, it was clear that Roosevelt had won another landslide victory. Most Americans wanted both him and the New Deal. In spite of the New Deal's efforts, some big industries still refused to recognize trades unions. So in 1936 and 1937, a wave of sit-down strikes swept the country. Workers in all kinds of jobs refused to leave their workplaces in protest. All over industrial America, especially in the steel, car and rubber industries, picketing by strikers went on. Some firms employed private armies of strike breakers to break up picket lines. To many employers in 1937, all union members were dangerous communists and deserved to be treated as such. But gradually, the unions won their right to be recognized, though many people, frightened by the strikes, didn't put their money into industry, and unemployment rose again in 1938. Once more, the dole queues appeared. But at least now the government was ready to play its part. The unemployed would no longer have to scavenge in dustbins to keep alive. Social Security and old-age pensions had been firmly established. By the late 30s, the New Deal had begun to transform the country. Government agencies built roads, homes, schools, hospitals, and public buildings of all kinds. The new dams of the TVA and other schemes not only gave work and electricity to many parts of the country, but it made millions of acres fertile again. There were fewer farmers now, but they were supported by guaranteed prices for their crops. Roosevelt's New Deal had increased the buying power of many more people. Yet in forcing it through, he offended many groups, big business, the Supreme Court. As he said himself with his customary grin, everybody is agin me, except the electorate. He'd brought America through some very dark days.
But as he expanded the role of the federal government, he raised taxes to pay for it. That was too much for his wealthy friends along the Hudson River. One of his neighbors was quoted as saying, "That man in the White House has gone too far."
And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
They came to Washington by the thousands. Defying the blistering cold to bear witness to history. The inauguration of an American president. FDR left the White House to drive down Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Capitol. The year was 1941. After 8 tumultuous years as president, Roosevelt, with 54% of the vote, had been re-elected for an unprecedented third term.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
History would look kindly on the patrician that spoke the language of the dispossessed.
I share the view of almost all historians that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the greatest president of the 20th century. And beyond this, I think that the policies he adopted to deal with this terrible crisis of the Great Depression are the most imaginative, the most creative of any president in our history.
Under threatening skies and a cold northerly wind, FDR appeared supremely confident. His words reaffirmed his abiding faith in America and his determination to carry the nation back to prosperity.
this great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
Roosevelt made it clear that he was demanding broad executive authority to...
In 1932, as dole queues lengthened across America, 13 million were out of work. Nearly a third of the people relied on handouts from private charities. There was no welfare state to help them. It was the time of the Great Depression. Evictions became a common sight as people could no longer afford to keep up their payments for their furniture and their homes. The Republican president, Herbert Hoover, really believed in self-help, not government help. He thought a welfare state encouraged idleness. His efforts to halt unemployment had been too little and too late. Now the very poor had to live in shanty towns, which they bitterly called Hoovervilles.
The evidence of decline was everywhere. 13 million Americans were out of work, millions living beyond the point of despair. Soup kitchens and squatter camps reflected the new reality. These were the worst of times. After 4 years in power, the Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover was a beaten man. He insisted that the Wall Street crash of October 1929 was a result of economic forces beyond his or anyone else's control. Not so, argued the supremely self-confident
In a newspaper interview at the time, Hoover told a reporter, "Nobody is actually starving." The mood in town and country was one of hopelessness and despair. It seemed that things would never get better.
There were some commentators by 1932 who believed that they were watching the end of an historical era in which laissez-faire free market capitalism was absolutely imploding and proving its historical bankruptcy.
Charismatic governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, at the age of 50, was seeking the Democratic nomination for president.
This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
In essence, Roosevelt ascended to the presidency when he accepted that nomination. In the 1932 election, he had one overwhelming advantage. He wasn't the incumbent. Roosevelt won nearly 60% of the popular vote. He accepted the affirmation of the nation from his home in Hyde Park along New York's Hudson River.